Welcome to the digital podcast that explores how different organizations transform the way they create and capture value with digital technology. Today we have Professor of Practice Mark Skilton, who will talk to us about cloud sourcing strategies and new recent developments in this area. Mark, would you like to introduce yourself first before we start?
Well, thank you, Panos. As you said, I'm Professor of Practice at Warwick Business School. I'm in the Information Systems Management group. I hopefully don't show it, but I'm over 30 years practitioner in IT. And latterly, in the last probably 7 or 8 years, I've been involved in cloud computing. And really before that, as well as where it's heading into the future.
Okay, great. Now, in recent years, many organizations have tried to move operations to the cloud as a way of cutting down costs, reducing waste, becoming more efficient. And they have tried to do that by minimizing their investment in physical IT assets. And I think most of us would have heard some of the services offered either as an infrastructure as a service, software as a service, or platform as a service. Perhaps we can start by highlighting some of the benefits of each of these strategies or approaches to cloud solutions. And then maybe you can say a little bit about the maturity of the market in terms of how organizations adopt these type of models.
Yes, I mean, the way I'd like to approach this is to start about thinking about where did this come from. So back in a decade or so ago, we were talking about virtual machines, virtualization. And that's the ability, if you think about it at a basic level, is taking your hardware or your software and to encapsulate it into a virtualized machine or virtualized environment. And so the early stage of utility computing, which I'm talking around the year 2002, 2003, where it was fairly popular, working alongside service-oriented architecture, SOA, which is this idea of service enablement of IT. Then around 2004 or 5, we started to see cloud computing starting to become a language. And I always refer to a very well-known paper that I often quote called Above the Cloud by Berkeley University, no less, in California, where they were talking about the impact and abstraction of moving from virtualized machines to putting on a business management layer, an operations layer, if you will, which allows you to provision on demand. So that was really the genesis, the evolution towards cloud computing. It's a business model. It's just not just virtualization. It's actually enabling you to do probably 3 or 4 things. So we talk about on-demand elastic services. So what companies want to be able to do is to provision faster. The old style, if you will, is it's a bit slower to get hardware into place and by even setting up a virtualized machine. With cloud computing, you're getting the ability to provision things faster. Another couple of quick points is around self-service. So being able to do that, you have to have database administrators and people to look after the system. With cloud computing, as we've seen with software as a service, as you mentioned, I'll go through each of the 3 topics in a minute. It allows you to be much more self-service orientated. It reduces the overhead of management, if you will, of the end user, because they can do it themselves. And I think the third area is really, if you think about it, is about future-proofing. A lot of companies are kind of invested already in IT. IT's been around in my whole career, and even before I started work, IT was starting to become part of the business fabric, part of society now. We can't do anything. Even this video we're using the internet to send it to people. And what it helps companies to do, cloud computing, is to kind of future-proof their investment in IT, because it means instead of investing in this hardware or this particular technology, I can go and buy it as a service from a third party, or I can decouple it with my own private cloud, and I can start to swap in and out old technology for new. I can migrate more efficiently. And so really the 3 points then is about being more elastic and agile, being able to help self-service, empowering people, and then this ability to be much more future-proof is probably 3 areas I'd see. Now, in terms of the 3 models you mentioned, infrastructure as a service is really the whole hardware scene, the infrastructure scene. And where companies are kind of looking to try and do is to reduce really the number of servers they've got, the number of assets they're having to look after in IT. So you look at Amazon, which is a well-known cloud provider. It's in infrastructure as a service, it is hugely influential. I think it's something like 30-40% market share, and then its next competitor is about 2/3 of that. And one of the reasons that Amazon, and there are other companies that are equally very good at infrastructure as a service, is they've really understood the need to move from owning hardware and software to being able to just host it as infrastructure as a service. And now we're seeing that the network is starting to become also virtualized. So you have network as a service, hardware, compute as a service, storage as a service, all part of the infrastructure as a service arena, if you will. In terms of PaaS, platform as a service, that is sort of what we call development, integration, application program interfaces, APIs. And so what we're seeing with the cloud, and I call it like the glue layer that links between the hardware and the end user, the device. With PaaS, it's a completely different market, but companies still need to develop and test things quickly. And so they use dev in the cloud as a way of being more agile. So you see a lot of today in 2016, we talk about Scrum and Agile development, and we see cloud development environments being used for that. And then finally, software as a service, SaaS as we might call it, is really this genesis from owning software licenses to being able to just consume it like a service. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what we're doing there is this ability to start to pick and mix even types of applications and functions as a service, like a menu, a buffet, if you will. And there's this phrase in cloud computing, there are many, many buzzwords in cloud computing, but the one I like the most is eating on the menu or eating off the menu, a bit like a la carte, but it's not. What software as a service in a very simple way has allowed companies to do is to think about their portfolio of applications, to be able to offer standard self-service things I mentioned earlier, to be able to empower users to do much more with their software. My last point is really about innovation. When you think about the Internet of Things today, you think about big data, you think about AI, all these sort of, call it sexy new technologies coming out there. But if you think about it, they're now moving into software as a service, all becoming self-service and being able to enable you to do more. So the cloud is really matured now. You asked me about the maturity of it. It's past its early growth stages of moving from utility computing into mainstream enterprise computing as a paradigm for getting things done quickly and on demand. And now we're seeing it maturing now into sort of more specific capabilities that I mentioned, and I'll talk about that a bit later.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I don't want to touch on innovation as yet.
Yes.
Because I have a question for that later on. Maybe we can continue by maybe drawing on your expertise in understanding some of the challenges that different organizations face in choosing a cloud sourcing strategy. And maybe you can mention the difference between a small and medium-sized enterprise to a large enterprise, and the different challenges that they face depending on whether they choose to do infrastructure as a service or platform as a service or software as a service, of course, depending on their business model.
Yeah, I'll answer that in probably three steps.
Okay.
I mean, the first sort of simple way to think about it is the number of companies that I've been involved with in outsourcing. Very simply, they've already done their virtualization project. They've taken their hardware, their physical boxes of computing and applications and moved it into a virtual environment. What the first stage I often see with cloud computing adoption, to use the phrase, to onboard move into the cloud, to run your business in the cloud, whether you're a small company or a large company, is you're kind of putting it simply, counting the number of boxes and environments you're managing it today, and what can you do if you move that into the cloud environment that could be hosted by a third-party large provider like IBM or Oracle or a system integrator like Capgemini or Deloitte or whoever. And the question around that is the complexity of moving that, because in your existing system, you may have some system that you're actually not going to keep for much longer. So one of the complexities is understanding, let's say we've got to save 1,000 boxes here of different shapes and sizes of different computers and arrangements, different operating systems and standards. The complexity around that is then, so how can I standardize that? Which bits of it do I need to move into the cloud because I need to continue using it over the next 5 years? What parts of that, that 1,000 computing environment, 1,000 boxes, if you will, maybe 20 or 100 of those we don't need, so we can sort of migrate them away, we can get rid of them, we can divest in them. So a lot of the companies, I'm kind of trying to paint a picture here, and I've seen this for real. Whether it's in a virtual environment or a hardware environment, they need to work out what workloads can they move to the cloud environment is the first one, and it's a complex matching question. Second sort of point of 3 points I want to make is then thinking about what sort of new functionality. Now in IT, we often talk about, do you take the old way, and you just take the old way and just put it into the cloud and keep running the old business processes, but you just hosted it in a cloud environment. It's just a bit quicker to stand up and close down. The clever part, or the bit that we talk about, is transformation. And so the second point I want to make that is difficult for both small and large companies is how can we use the elasticity, the properties of the cloud, the on-demandness, if you will, of the cloud, to make us do business processes more smarter, quicker, cheaper. It's not just an IT feature, but it's actually enabling you to do more innovation, to be able to go to market with new products and services quicker, to collaborate better with your supply chain or your customer base or your social media communities. And you have to kind of rethink about how does my business process model, my business model look like in the cloud, is the second point. Then the third point I'd just like to say is you said about SMEs, small to medium-sized companies who don't have the big pockets of being able to buy their own data centers or pay for large cloud computing environments. They have to think about, well, can I just have one-stop shop? Can I just go and buy all of my business applications from one cloud vendor and just use that relationship? And that's often the case. You can go and get your general ledger, your sales, your stock management system. You get the whole thing in one cloud provider. But equally, though, they could say, well, I don't want to pay for anything. I'm just going to use open source. And so one of the questions around being a small company is, well, can I just get everything from one place? Or could I use open source and not hardly pay for any of it? Because a lot of this stuff now is free, or freemium, to use the phrase. Now, in the final part of this equation is in terms of very large companies, they can have thousands, literally thousands of applications and thousands of servers and things that they need to move, a portfolio to move into the cloud. And the complexity and challenge of that is considerable. It really is very complex. And part of the challenge is they have to think about is what is the complexity they've got to manage? Is there a way, a migration path? What is the easiest migration path to the cloud? And what sort of operations and skills do I need in-house as well as from my cloud provider to manage that risk in the movement? And so a lot of this is very capable now. Today in 2016, we're able to do a lot of this automatically. We can port machines from one cloud to another automatically. We can often move a lot of the data transformation because you've got to clean up all the data to move it to the cloud, software as a service. And so there's all these kind of services that are associated with the cloud. It's not just to take your USB pen and plug it in here and then move it into here. There's a lot of integration and movement, because if you think about it finally, you've got all this integrated mass of systems in a very large company. You then move that complexity into the cloud. You've still got the same complexity of integration. Yeah. So the trick there is to try and simplify it and migrate it. And so that's where a lot of consultancies get a lot of money and things like that, and also running it in-house. So I'm painting quite a diverse picture there, yes. But it's certainly the way to go in reducing your CapEx costs, yes. A way of transforming your operating costs, but there's lots of skills and issues you have to think about.
Right. Well, that brings me to this next question, which is about risks, risk management, and primarily security. Security is often described by primarily client organizations as one of the most important challenges in helping them make a decision as to whether to adopt a cloud sourcing model, irrespective of the size or the scope of the company. Exactly because of that complexity that develops in the process and this effort to integrate services and manage them and govern them in the way that will help them actually achieve that cost efficiency that you were talking about. So what can cloud providers do to establish this trust with the client organization and address these security concerns?
Yeah, I think it's really having a clear governance model. We hear about cyber attacks, data breaches, data being stolen, and very high-profile media cases. And you think about it, it's not only the customer data being stolen, but also it's about intellectual property, if it's industrial espionage. It could be about stealing money. It could be about but reputation risk as well. The company could literally go out of business if it loses all of its data, or its reputation it damages its brand. And so the consequences of the severity of this could be quite severe. What they have to do in terms of building a governance model is probably, I would break it up into two areas. One is, you need to have the sort of, to your customer, you need to have proper identity management, so they know who you are. When you log in, you've got password protection, just some basic sort of perception and reality going on here. In terms of going into a cloud service, that the customer knows that there is a requirement to have strong security. They may have, say, virtual private network connections, if that phrase, you can offer these additional assurances and use these as part of the way of managing the front door of the cloud service to your customers. And often, without mentioning any particular profiles of cyber hacks, often that area hasn't been managed well, and that's where the hackers manage to get through the website and then they get inside the organization. And then on the other side, just briefly, is about encryption. When, even if somebody inside who may have less than noble intentions to maintain your security internally as an operations employee or a subcontractor or whatever may be the cause of this, there needs to be good disciplines and skills within the organization to say that we are encrypting data, we are controlling data, we're doing backups and recovery. And what I like to see in user agreements, looking at the contract, when you tick a box or opt in to use a cloud service, there should be clear sort of security policies that the company is saying, we will follow this with your data. We will tell you whether we use it for third-party use. We will tell you that we will encrypt it and say that this is something, we will keep your data for however long it is. It's visibility to build trust with your consumers. And whether you're even a private cloud or a public cloud or whatever it is, it's having a very clear vision and capability to understand all of the security issues that you need. And so it's a big subject. It's not something that can be answered quickly. But where I see security falling down is when they don't sort out the front window, if you will, and they don't have the disciplines and practices internally to control the robustness of the system. And it's whether it's not even a cloud issue, it's just good IT practice.
Right. So just since you mentioned private and public clouds, can you say a little bit about that and how perhaps security, I know you mentioned that it's not about whether it's a private or a public cloud, but perhaps you can mention a little bit about what the difference is in terms of security and handling security.
Yeah, I mean, put in a nutshell, it's really, if your data is sensitive in terms, it could be medical data, it could be your bank account details, it could be your intellectual property for an engineering design or your brand marketing campaign or whatever it is, then that kind of data is something you want to have security controls over. And so sometimes companies may make the decision that they can't move that to the public cloud because it, by its very nature, has many different tenants from different companies that may not necessarily will get into your data, but it has potentially less security. It's not in the sense it's less secure, but it's not within your domain. You're using a public cloud that is being typically managed by another third party. In a private cloud, typically, let's say that take this scenario that you're running your own private cloud, it's within your four walls, if you will, and you've got more control over the data environment. It doesn't necessarily mean it's any secure. You can have private clouds, paradoxically, you can get public cloud providers, outsourcers, running private clouds for you, following all of the due diligence requirements for a private cloud. But I'd say, just in a nutshell, it's the nature of your data. If your data is highly secure and highly sensitive, typically that will go into a private cloud, not a public cloud. So that differentiation hasn't gone away. It's a constant battle. I call it a war, a cyber war, if you will, of keeping ahead of the cyber attacks and the defences, and then obviously the legal position around government and things like that.
Great. Okay, I want to change the focus a bit and bring up the importance of innovation, which you already mentioned. Our clients and cloud providers are increasingly beginning to recognize the strategic importance of sourcing. So sourcing is not just a cost-cutting practice anymore. It's about developing relationships that will lead to new services or new products. So one way to take advantage of new and emerging businesses is to try to source your services or functions to multiple providers. And in a way, this is trying to achieve or enabling organizations to play catch-up with emerging business trends, because you have access to different suppliers, therefore you have access to more knowledge, therefore you can be more quick in your decision making. How would you respond to that type of strategy?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of multi-sourcing, or you can even do single sourcing or multi-sourcing onshore or offshore, but let's talk about multi-sourcing, is exactly what you're saying. It's almost like trying to pick a service provider for your software as a service, or your infrastructure as a service, or your development as a service, if you will, to pick a provider that does exactly the sort of workloads and services you're looking for your type of industry. If you're in a retail industry or if you're in a banking industry, they have potentially different requirements. One's about very secure environments, financials. Retail could be all about the supply chain. So it's all about having a distributed cloud model, if you will. So it's about finding relationships to build out your multiple sourcing portfolio of contracts. But equally, though, in that very statement I've just made, you then have this thing about, there's a phrase with one insurance company I was working with recently. They said, well, we now have 3 or 4 layers in our outsourcing architecture. We've got the devices and mobile cloud services with one provider, outsourcer. We've then got the applications area outsourced with another provider. We then have the network layer outsourced to a telecoms company provider. And then we then have our data centers outsourced to another. So what I've just said in that scenario, we've got 4 different layers, if you will, of outsourcing, a multi-sourcing contract. But then you then have back-to-back contract questions. You know, if this goes wrong or this goes wrong, how does the net, and so it works. You get the best, if you will, of the layers of the best of both worlds. But it also creates new challenges about, and there's a phrase called one throat to choke, which is not a particularly glamorous or friendly comment to make perhaps, but it is very much, if you've got, say, an issue with IT service, you have first, second and third line support. You then have a question, well, do I talk to the people with the device layer, or do I talk to the network layer, or do I talk to the data center? You start to get this kind of multi-sourcing challenge. But it's a trade-off. You get benefits, and then you have other issues of operation. But about access to innovation, your question earlier, you should, in theory, be getting the best solutions for each of those layers, if you will. And it's about sourcing and getting the best sort of solution. As I said at the beginning of my introduction, it's about future-proofing. So you don't have to keep reinvesting in network technology or reinvesting in the latest applications. Part of your relationship with an outsourcer is you want them to be giving you or helping you bring in and be able to show you new ideas and new innovation. There's a term called managed innovation. It sounds like an oxymoron. How can you manage innovation? Well, you can, because part of the new dynamic model of multi-sourcing today is about innovation that outsourcing that continually innovates with a client, and it continually becomes the source of ideas. And that's when outsourcing works at its best.
Great. You mentioned earlier this idea of systems integration, and in association to that, I want to raise the question of governance. And I know you've worked in the past for a big consultancy firm doing exactly that, doing systems integration. How would you approach this type of problem of multi-sourcing from a systems integration perspective? And perhaps you can say a little bit about the role of big consultancies in this area and how they help establish governance structures to manage these relationships.
I'll probably answer that with 3 steps. And there's more than 3 steps in this process. It's quite complex in most cases. The first one I'll talk about is standards. Often when you're dealing with IT, regardless of whether it's cloud or not, is you have what we call heterogeneity, or non-standard data sources, non-standard applications, because they've been customized and they've changed over time. So one of the starting points, if you will, of moving to a cloud or doing the system integration and from your ERP system, your enterprise resource planning system, to say your CRM system, your customer relationship management system or whatever, or to connecting it to your mobile devices, what sort of data standards, how are we going to get data from this system to this system? And so part of the challenge is really working out standards around data, standards around hardware and software, even in the cloud, making sure that they are able to connect up, to interoperate, to port from one system to another, those phrases. So part of the consulting service or the in-house IT department is sorting out the standardization of that, because the idea of standards makes two things. One is hopefully reduces the complexity of the system, so it's less difficult to maintain, but also allows you to potentially swap in and out more agile. There's more flexibility in the structure of the IT system. And part of, certainly one of my areas of interest, and I've worked with ISO and the Open Group I'm very, very closely associated with around TOGAF and enterprise architecture standards. There's a continuous evolution of standards become better and more elaborative and collaborative and open, as well as enabling companies to build their own proprietary best practice as well. Mm-hmm. The other one around system integration perhaps is around working out the business process side. So consultancy, you asked me what system integration is, as I said earlier, my earlier sort of example of working out how do I run, I don't want to just take my existing business and just port it to the cloud and just carry on as if nothing's happened. Mm-hmm. I want to start consultancies and system integrators want, as part of the innovation, is trying to design what elasticity, on demand, pay as you go, all those kind of cloud characteristics. Translating that into the business is like saying, well, how can I build new products and services to the marketplace quicker? Mm-hmm. How can I introduce and grow my customer base better? If I'm in a public or federal sector, how can I offer value for money to my government and to citizens? How can I use these new elastic characteristics of cloud computing to enable you to be a more agile and responsive organization, more innovative organization? And so there are lots of things in migrating to the cloud. We now see big data, we now see Internet of Things as other buzzwords coming in, and we see new workloads, if you will, which is what I would describe it as, becoming part of that portfolio, that tapestry, that layout of infrastructure and services. And there's a phrase where the cloud is the fabric. It becomes the glue or the fabric that enables you to plug all these things in. So as you can tell, I'm very excited about it. It's a fascinating area to be in, but it's also extremely challenging to figure out where to play and what to do. But hopefully that covers some of the things you were asking.
No, that's great. Well, that's all the questions that I had. Would you like to make any final comments about all the things that we've discussed? And maybe say a little bit about some new trends in cloud computing.
Yeah, probably two things. One is around, certainly in the last 5 years with cloud, we've heard the rise of what we call cloud brokers, cloud orchestrators, cloud aggregators. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of organizations see the cloud as a platform strategy, a digital platform strategy, either for their mobile devices or for their marketplace, or for their the way they collaborate internally to make their, call it the digital workforce, if you will, or your customer. So what I've seen in recent years is the movement of what we call disintermediation, because what cloud does, or web services, or digital services, if you will, is the ability to almost disintermediate yourself from your traditional physical supply chain into doing more services in the cloud, more services in a marketplace. And so I've seen that as a kind of a sort of a game changer shift that has happened in many, many sectors. My last point, I guess, is really the new stuff that's coming along. I mean, two areas that are really interesting is this thing called micro clouds or containers. So we go from the virtual machines to Docker, which is one of, there's not just Docker, there's a few other core OS and a few other containers. And so we're going from, if you think about it, it's called in IT speak granularity. We go from hardware to virtual machines, so hardware machine, physical bare metal machine, to virtual machine, virtualized machine, to containers, which are like smaller virtual containers, if you will. What you'll see coming up with Docker and other things, and it's quite popular at the moment with developers, is being able to almost modularize all of your applications and services now, so they become like very agile containers that can just be plugged into different machines and clouds. So I'm just summarizing it very simply here. And what I'm expecting to see in the technical area in the next 3 to 4 years is this movement from large clouds to just buying micro clouds for just the things you need to do. And so it's all evolving very fast. And then finally, I've mentioned big data, I've mentioned Internet of Things. I think what I'll also see, IBM Watson with machine learning and AI. I think the future of the cloud certainly would say high performance computing is one, with supercomputing becoming in the cloud as well, but also about machine intelligence. All that data that's being sucked into the cloud, just think of where does all this data come? It has to be hosted somewhere, it's hosted in the cloud. And what's going to happen is you're going to see lots and lots of analytical services starting to come out. You know, the people watching this, the next big area for IT and business to get into, and if you're not into it already, you will be, is around analytics in the cloud. It's extremely powerful, extremely exciting. You just look at some of the consumer products coming out, like my favorite at the moment is Amazon Echo. You can just talk to this machine that's connected to the cloud, and it will just talk back to you. And it'll just answer questions, and it's all machine learning going on. It's at the response time of the cloud and the network. That is the power of the cloud of the future. And it's just down to your imagination, because the speed and the response time, the capability there, the commoditization cost price point allows you to be able to do this at an effective return on investment model. So the cloud is really just the warm-up act. And I think the next 5 years will be phenomenal, exciting.
That's great. Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you for this very exciting and insightful discussion. And thank you for watching.